what Jerry has said, but going back in time in terms of how the church understood formation, there's always the danger in the faith journey of doing theology in which we just talk about ideas. So biblical theology, systematic theology, historic theology. These can be interesting mind games in which we reflect on ideas as they've been thought through philosophically, theologically in the history of the church. But we do know just because someone has sorted out or tried to sort out the truths of the faith does not mean their heart and their life has been dealt with in any significant way or manner. The same with biblical exegetes. People can do splendid works on interpreting the Old, the New Testament, the Apocrypha, all of these works. But it can be very, very much, one could be examining a tree trunk or a human body. You stand distant from the text, examine it, reflect on it, ideas, text, and you try and deliver what is seen as objective truths, objective information of what the text has said and how the church has interpreted. That doesn't necessarily translate into human experience. And we do know anyone who's worked with people who are fairly sophisticated biblical exegetes, Christian theologians, historians of tradition, does not mean they do not have their blind spots, does not mean they have not made gaffes in their lives, does not mean they have not dealt with their shadows in themselves. And some of the stories of the leaders of the church today who can be quite articulate at the level of ideas or textual exegesis, we are discovering more and more in some pretty tragic stories in some of their lives, because the translation of ideas into life has not taken place. And part of the task of an order is to say it's not that ideas versus life, it's what's the relationship of thinking to transformation, and in the church to deification or theosis, as the word is. Christ became human, as Athanasius would argue, so that humans could be divinized as they participate in the very nature of Christ and in the life of the church itself. So the early church, which was called the Patristic Era from the second, because most people when they think of particularly if they're coming from a Protestant tradition, the major text is of course the Bible. But what happened after the Bible in terms of the growth of Christianity? Exactly. Well, that's a tendency of Protestants to think. Until Luther.
Yeah.
Did really nothing happen? I mean, this was the period, in fact, of the greatest growth of Christianity because it brought on board some of the most thoughtful philosophers and theologians of their time, as well as men and women who were at the forefront of asking what's the relationship between thinking and internal transformation in terms of how we live our lives in a meaningful way in the context of the church and in the context of the world itself. And so education, in the older sense of the Latin educare, meant drawing out what a person in fact is meant to be in thought, word, and deed. This preoccupied the great thinkers from Origen forward, right up to the latter part of what's called the Fathers. And so when people often, if they come to Christianity in a Protestant tradition, there's absolutely no memory of this period of time. So what was actually going on after the period of Acts, for example, or Paul's writings in the letters? Well, women and men were coming along and trying to articulate faith in an age where many people, in fact, had not grown up in a Jewish tradition. Okay, the Jewish tradition, or what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew canon, was the sacred text of a very small minority of people in the Roman Empire or the Hellenized Roman world. Most of the women and men who had grown up in the late antique world, they had grown up on Homer and Hesiod and Aeschylus and Plato and Aristotle and Virgil. This was their sacred text, not the Bible. Most of them were totally unaware of the Bible in terms of, but when they came to Christianity, largely philosophically, many of them, particularly the women and men who became leaders of the church, like in the West, Augustine or Ambrose or Benedict, who was mentioned this morning, or Jerome, great exegete. In the East, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, Maximus the Confessor, Macrina, the two Macrinas, who really nurtured their sons, who became some of the most important theologians in the Eastern church. They were grappling with a culture that was very opposed to Christianity, or at least skeptical of Christianity, and these women and men had to articulate to their world why Christianity was meaningful, why skeptical people should accept it, And out of that emerged what we today call Christian civilization by the second, as Rome was collapsing. So in Augustine's great work, The City of God, I've taught it 3 times. I think some of you in here probably taken my class. You've done City of God with me, and yeah, Taylor has, and Caleb. He's the first 10 books of the City of God, which is considered one of the most important works in the West. He's looking at the Roman tradition, the Hellenized Roman tradition, and he's looking at essentially its rot from the center, and why Christianity in books 11 to 22 can supply that lack and build up a meaningful civilization built on faith. And out of that, we get certainly Western civilization, and the same thing was going on in Eastern Christianity, which we know is the Orthodox Church today. Now, when these people received the Bible, of course, it wasn't canonized until the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea. This is important to understand as well. It didn't drop like United Parcel Service out of the sky in the 1st century. This took centuries to become canonized. But the task for them was, how are we to interpret this text? And in the history of Christianity, certainly in the patristic era and the medieval or the Middle Ages, they developed a very nuanced way of approaching the Bible. The tendency since the Reformation is you take the text as an authoritative text and you interpret it in a literal, historical, grammatical, contextual way. It's like an object you analyze and then you attempt to apply personally in some ways to one's own devotional life. And that has always been seen, and this is where you get into some sort of really problematic debates for people who are literalists. So you go, for example, back to Genesis, for example. Some people, day, young earth, and then you're into this science debate with religion. And while the Bible says a day, it must mean a day equals so many years, therefore the earth is 6,000 years. And of course you get this huge Noah's Ark. Can we find the Ark? Carbon dating the wood, where's Mount Ararat? Can't. So you get into these issues of, if you take the thing literally, then what do you do when there is not evidence to verify or falsify it? Some people just chuck the text in that sense. Now, the early church never, for the most part, reduced the reading of the Bible to a literal, grammatical, historical, contextual, literary read. That has come to dominate since the 16th century for various reasons, if we had time to get into it, the rise of science and being able to prove something empirically and objectively, and we can trust this text. The early church, from the post-apostolic period right through the fathers and mothers of the East and West, said, they used an analogy, 2 analogies. One is an orange. The external of the orange is the literal, and you have to peel that back to get to the sweetness of the orange, okay? So there's a sweetness in the text that if you only approach it literally, a person is going to miss. The nut, for example, there's a hard side and you crack it and you get to the sweet kernel inside. So when the fathers of the church, they said, okay, there's the rind of the text and then there's the sweet juice of the text. There's the hard shell of the literal, but when you crack that nut, you get to the mystical or the contemplative element, which is the sweet kernel. So there were 6 levels of interpreting any text by which the mothers and the fathers articulated, and this has become a standard way of interpreting, and particularly the application for formation and experience and what it means for self-knowledge and a deeper level of transformation. And so people are not so much just the victims of their own drivenness. And I want to take you a little bit on that road. I'll take 3 images from the Old Testament, or the Hebrew canon, and maybe one from John 21, and because John was the great mystical theologian of the church, and he located with Mary, Jesus' mother, to Ephesus. And he had to encounter pretty sophisticated Greek culture at Ephesus. And so the book of John is really engaging, even with its beginning. In the beginning was the word in Greek, it's einarchichologos. And it's often been poorly interpreted as in the beginning, and I'll get into this a little bit. Arche does not mean beginning in Greek, it means the ground of all things. And logos means the presencing of that which is coming to us, and so it often is interpreted in a problematic way, and I'll get to that and what John was up to as he encountered some of the great Greek culture, Hellenized Greek culture, as he tried to articulate and present the faith to people who had no background in a Jewish background and had been raised in pretty sophisticated philosophical traditions, Neoplatonism, Manichaeism, all sorts of Eastern religions were very, very much in vogue at the time. So if I can just give an analogy today, I've had students in my class, you mentioned the Bible, I've had students who said, what's the Bible? You know, this is how far we've come down a secular path in terms of not even knowing what the text is, and then other people, well, I've heard of it, but I don't know what's in it. It's supposed to be an important book. This would be similar to many of the people who came to Christianity from the 2nd to the 8th century. They had no background in the Jewish tradition. The early disciples did, obviously, but once they moved out of that Palestinian Jerusalem orbit, in fact, they were encountering a culture which had no knowledge of, and so their great classics, as I meant, would have been the great Greco-Roman classics. Just like people today, what would be some of the myths people turn to today when they have no background in Christianity, the Bible, Western civilization? What becomes sort of meaningful mythic texts for them? Harry Potter. Star Wars. Mm-hmm. Star Trek.
Lord of the
Rings. These become, because they have Walt Disney stories, these become their mythic realities. So in the late antique world, just as today, if there is no background in a sacred text, the culture itself provides sacred texts for them to read. And so an idea with lots, this is why, for example, I would say that the popularity of Jordan Peterson at the present time, he's doing an exegesis of Genesis. He's doing now an exegesis of Exodus. For example, he's appealing to a whole generation of people with either had a background, but a very literal background that doesn't speak to them anymore, and he's giving it a psychological, allegorical read of the text. And so I'm going to touch briefly on that allegorical approach of the text. Sometimes it's called tropological. It can be called allegorical. And I'm going to just look at 3 instances and then maybe one on John, and I could go through actually the whole Hebrew canon and almost take one thing after another and look at how the early mothers and fathers, the Ammas and the Abbas, read it for personal internalization and then transformation. The first one would be Genesis. Genesis in Greek is Genesis. It's the first of all great stories, okay? Just as Exodus, exodos, it's the way out, exodos, the trail out in that sense. Genesis, the story is, of course, if you read it literally, it's about Adam. It's just a word that means humanity, and Eve. And there's a story of a tree. Now, the tree historically is always the myth in almost cultures of the human soul. Okay, so the big issue for it's the mothers and fathers, as in classical civilization. The issue was, okay, where are your roots planted for your soul? What sort of soil is your roots in? And of course, God says to Adam and Eve, pick from the fruit of various desires, fruit just being a desire in that sense that can fulfill you, but be wary of indulging the appetites of other desires. Okay? And so this becomes a key myth in terms of the human soul. When you unpack that metaphor, the big issue for the mothers and fathers as they interpreted the text, what soil are you planted in? What happens when the soil is thin or it's not nutritious? How deep do the roots go in a person's own soul? And then what are the desires we are picking from that in fact may be desires that are harmful and hurtful in terms of who we are? And what happens when we indulge certain appetites, desires? This is why Augustine would talk about ordo amoras, the ordering of our desires, and what happens when our desires are not properly oriented between good, better, best, bad, worst, worse. And how do we know those desires, and how do we have the ability to reflectively analyze on those desires? This is what, in one sense, the Jesuits were getting at, Ignatius was getting at, when he talked about what voice are you listening to? Because we can have many voices inside whispering to us, think about this, follow this little path, and what happens if you follow that little path? And why don't you follow this? They can be paths of cynicism, they can be of skepticism, they can be sexual little pathways that you can follow, they can be sensual, they can be judgmental, they can be issues of bitterness and anger. There's all these little whisperings, despair, I'm just giving up. And so a lot hinges on the image of the tree. And when that ocean of the tree of the soul is unpacked, is what fruit or what voices are we listening to? And how far are we going to go down the path of certain voices that we listen to that can lead to isolation, They can lead to people don't understand me. They can lead to judgmentalism, depending on how low or high, because within the Christian tradition there was always three layers to the human soul. There was the physical, the sarx, the suke, the center, and the pneuma, the spirit, and all can go bad. So it's not like spirit versus body, because spirit, I mean, the demon is a spirit. So it's the notion that somehow we've got to be more spiritual. Who's virgin? Who's virgin? Okay, whose version of the spirit? So it doesn't become an issue of spirit, body, or mind, affections. It's what part of us is controlling that? What part of us is back of that? And when the mothers and fathers of the church looked at the notion of the tree and began to look at it as an analogy for the human soul, what they were getting at is the fruit. Some fruit are good desires to listen to if they lead to a deeper meaning of self-understanding, of love and of care for the other, and a greater integration with people in society in a just and peaceful manner. But if they listen to other voices, they can come from the spirit, they can come from the soul or the body. If a person is not right inside, then they're going to be and then what happens, then they lose their Eden center, or what's called the image and likeness of God within. The mothers and fathers of the church never saw, like many Protestants have done, the notion of total depravity or original sin, meaning we were incapable of making meaningful decisions. They always argued the image that God created in humans could never be destroyed. It was like gold, pure gold or a diamond. Now what happens is because of our choices and others, you get dirt around it. You get dirt around it, or dust gets on the mirror of the soul. And the task, for example, when the dirt gets around the gold, what seems to be God's fire burning, it's not burning our true nature, it's burning away who we are not, so we actually can become who we actually are. And so we often cling to notions of ourself that we have to die to because it's not even our real self. And so people often fear the fire of the divine. We should always greet the fire of the divine, because what it does, it burns away what has to be burned away, so we get to actually who we are as bearers of the pure gold or diamond of God himself, of which Christ has come in the purest way to embody and reveal for us. And so the Genesis myth, which is the first of all the great truths, is about the human soul and about what voices or what desires we choose to listen to that lead to light, to lead to life, that lead to meaning, to lead to depth and purpose, and where are that fruit we can indulge in that in fact is toxic and poison, but it often lures like an angel of light. I mean, because evil very rarely appeals as darkness and tails and horns. It always appeals seductively, anyone who's had a chance to read Milton's great work, The Paradise Lost, will realize in the most compelling way how attractive Satan is. How can you say no to Satan? He is so compelling, so attractive, so winsome, and he's bringing real freedom. He's bringing real freedom. And so when I taught religious studies for many years, along with philosophy and political science, I had a couple of times the head of the Wiccan Society in my class. And the Wiccans and the Gnostics often interpret Genesis as God preventing people from truly being free by saying you shouldn't indulge these certain desires. And so there's a totalitarian God who in fact is preventing people from truly being free. And it's only by making those choices to violate what God asked them to do that they become free from this totalitarian tyrant in the heavens. Okay, so this is a way of interpreting, and you can see how Satan in Paradise Lost really plays this one. And Milton understood it so well. And if anyone get a chance, of course, studying Milton I was fortunate to study Milton with Jesuits, and so it's very rare for Jesuits to be teaching Milton, given who he is, but it was just a treat to study with them. So this first image then is the whole symbol of the tree and the relationship of the tree to the soul, to desire. The second one I'll briefly touch on, and I'm going way past, it's one I'm supposed to be done at 1:15. Many mea culpas, penances in order. I'll do these two quick for you. And of course the Hebrew canon is just thick with any of these. We could just go on and on. The second is Cain and Abel. Now the Cain and Abel, of course, can be read in terms of a brother who perhaps is a little too ambitious. He feels that God isn't listening to him, and he goes out and kills his brother Abel, if you read that literally. Now when read allegorically, as the church read it, Cain was the one following sort of Evelyn Underhill. We spend too much time conjugating three verbs, to want, to have, and to do. We don't know what it means to be still and just to be and wait upon the ultimate, wait upon God. And so what Cain was essentially doing, Cain the activist was killing Abel the contemplative. And this is the way the early church read the Cain. And you see this then fast forward into the Mary-Martha story, huh? Mary and Martha. Martha becomes Cain, and Abel is Mary. And Jesus says, who's chosen the better part? And this is the contemplative Mary. And so right in the Genesis account, you get the clash between what we call the vita active and the vita contemplativa, embodied in the Cain and Abel story itself. And so you can see these tensions which are at work in the text, and how the early mothers and fathers, they prioritize the contemplative, the listening, the being still, the slowing down, and listening to something deeper rather than a competing source of voices going on, which Plato understood so well in some of his key works in philosophy. So the Cain and Abel story. Exodus, just once more. Again, the Exodus story can be about the journey of the Jews in bondage to Egypt, to Pharaoh, finally being called out, crossing the Red Sea, and the promised land. Now, read allegorically, I was very fortunate I was doing my second MA at University of British Columbia, and I was fortunate, perhaps in retrospect it was, but I had one of the most rigorous sort of Greek scholars from Cambridge, who was and so I did one course, we were translating Greg of Nice's Life of Moses. I was terrorized every time I went into him, because he would stop me every sentence and say, I don't like that parsing and the grammatical. So it was like it was a trial by fire translating Life of Moses by Gregory of Nyssa. But on the other far end of it, I was very grateful. My level of patristic Greek was up to an even higher level after 2 years of classical Greek and then 2 of Koine, but patristic Greek itself. But the Exodus is very interesting too when read allegorically. We are in Egypt becomes the bondage to the false self. Okay, this is where we give ourselves to the leeks, the melons, all the attractions, the amusements, the diversions of the world that we live in, and in fact we begin to lose ourselves. We think that we at a certain point they realize they're in bondage, but this is where the interesting story begins. What's it like? God calls people to freedom from that false self, the Egypt, the pharaonic self that wants to dominate, the egoistic self that wants to dominate. God wants to free us to become who we are truly meant to be in that sense. But leaving the Egypt of the false self into the freedom of our new being, the temptation is when we begin to break out. Of course, there's going to be 1,000 oppositions to that. And within the human soul, again and again, as people try and break out of that Egypt of the false self, there's a whole variety of, it's nicer to stay there, it's not that bad, yes, you're in bondage, but widely. But the whole journey of freedom, you hit the desert. The desert is the place where there's nothing anymore. All the ways we defined ourselves, we've understood ourselves, found predictability, security, comfort, all that's taken away. Now who am I in the desert? And that's the place of emptiness. And of course, the whole nature of the faith journey is the journey of letting go and becoming empty. And it's only in that place of death that, in fact, the resurrection of our new being begins. This is the whole, any of the great myths we've looked at, whether it's Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, they're all, the underlying myth is death, resurrection. Gandalf has to die to the gray to become the white. Harry Potter has to die to resurrect. These are all, it's a common story in all great myths. And so the book of Exodus, when read allegorically, is the way out of from our false self, the old Adam, the old Eve. We go through the desert of emptiness, which is a very painful place. And many of the great mystics have talked about the dark night of the soul, the cloud of unknowing, the time of emptiness. Where is God? And these very hard and difficult questions, which the Jews were asking in the desert, of letting go of the things we cling too tenaciously to, and we define ourselves, and we even link God into that definition. And all those have to die to be deconstructed in that sense until we actually emerge truly free in our faith journey. One more New Testament, and then I'll scamper. I could go through any of these. Each of these images are actually whole 2 or 3 hour lectures in terms of how the early church peeled back the rind and got the sweet juice. The one in John 21, As I said, when Jesus was on the cross, I suspect most of Mary's family didn't understand Mary very well in terms of the burden she carried with Jesus, and it was a difficult journey for Mary. And John, I suspect most of his family did not understand his deep mystical understanding, and he was the closest there was to Jesus. So it's fascinating that when Jesus is dying on the cross, he understood Mary's empathetic understanding of who he was and John's empathetic understanding of Mary and Jesus for who they were. So as he's dying in the deepest part of suffering, he says to John, Mary, this is your son. And then, as it were, Mary becomes the mother to John, and John becomes the son to Mary. Where they go, the Johannine community then moves. Most of it's, again, we think of just the biblical period, to be asking the question, what happened after the biblical community? Well, the whole Johannine form of Christianity moved up to Ephesus, and this was a great center of Greek culture and Greek civilization, Ephesus. If you read John 21, just to give you a hint, there's so much can be said about the book of John, but I don't know, many of you probably, when you did in your Sunday school, you read that when the disciples and Jesus resurrected and they went out and caught the fish. Do you remember that story? How many fish did they catch?
153.
153? Do you know why 150? I mean, do you think disciples, we got one, we got two, with fish squirming and leaping all around? Any thoughts on why 153, perhaps? John immersed in Ephesian community, the center of Greek culture and Pythagorean philosophy. And the image of fish? It's not a literal text.
There's a certain symbolism behind the number 153.
Sure, yeah. Anything. So it's not literal. You don't read any of John literally. He's taking all Old Testament images: Jesus, shepherd, man in the desert, I am the manna. Everything is chance. It's what's called typology. Okay, the old is a type of the new in that sense, and Jesus can be found in so much, whether it's Noah's Ark and Abraham, Isaac, all these. But yeah, 153. So in Pythagorean philosophy, 153 is the perfect number. Okay, and so and of course the notion of fishing. What's happening is the church 153 is the perfect embodiment of the new community that's coming into being, and the Johannine community in Ephesus is embodying that at a local level. And that's what John is articulating through the use of that number. And so the more a person probes, because John is addressing both the Pythagorean community, the Hellenized community in Ephesus, and calling them to a faith by saying, hint, hint, here's a little road sign, and this is what Christianity is about. But if it's just read literally, then you think, oh, they caught 153 fish, isn't that interesting? And who really cares what they caught 150? John's doing far more. He's giving hints, signals, pointers to say, I'm going to introduce the Hellenized Pythagoreans to Christianity by using their very symbols to point out we, in fact, are the fulfillment of their very longings. So this is grace-fulfilling nature in the very use of that number itself. So again, it can be read literally, but that's not what John is up to. And the more you get inside of John's spirit and mind and imagination and what he is doing in that great work of the book of John, that's just one more. So all four stories that I just mentioned, the Genesis story, the Cain, Abel, and this 123, as well as the Exodus. Underneath all of them is the same story. What do we have to let go of to be truly free? And this is why I mentioned this morning in my little thing, is the Bartimaeus. We often are not aware. Sometimes we can be acutely aware of our blind spots and what we're having to deal with. But sometimes those subtler elements, we don't even know we're blind to something. And that's part of what would be called, in certainly the biblical language, the old Adam or the old Eve. And we often identify ourselves too closely with what we are not. And then it's very hard to let go of that. But it's in the letting go of it, in fact, our new being in Christ emerges, our new eternal being, which is being deified as we participate in Christ in the church itself. And so underneath it all, the question often to ask then in quietness is, what in me? Can we name those things in ourselves? Crude, some obvious, but it's a subtler thing is, what in me do I have to let go of? Just not symptomatic issues. Some of you probably, when you were young or with your own kids, I used to take our kids to circuses. You ever play the Baffle Ball game? Some of you probably played that. you go to a circus and the little head pops up, that goes under, it comes up, bap it somewhere else, it comes up. What?
Whack-a-mole.
Oh, you call it whack-a-mole, we call it bap-a-mole. Yeah. The danger is you can sort of bap the head of one, but then it comes up in another place. You bap it, so you're hitting the symptom. You're not dealing with the mole. And at the heart of true transformation is actually grabbing the mole of our false self and not dealing with the symptoms. Where I'll never forget once, and I'll leave it with this. I was hitchhiking across Canada, it would have been mid-70s, and a fellow picked me up, and he says, I've been alcoholic for 10 years, and he says, I finally kicked it, and I'm working 12 hours a day. I said, you just traded addictions. You bap the mold one, but you haven't dealt with the addiction, which is deep in there. And so it's one thing to deal with the symptom. It's another thing to track the symptom to the very non-being within us that has to die so that all these symptoms themselves dissipate like a cloud under the sky. So all of these stories that, in fact, when the mothers and fathers got to them, they were constantly saying, so what does this mean? Not just for parsing ideas and pulling ideas together, but for our own transformation and self-understanding of becoming our new being of Christ in the church. That's hard work. That's hard work. And those things stay with us to the end. It's not like I've dealt with the tough issues, now they're over. Those things, the monkey's on our back right to the end, okay? And it's discerning people know how to deal with it. Undiscerning people often use religion to serve their narcissistic or egoistic purposes. The lovely quote in T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedrals, he says, sadly so, many people often use the greater cause to serve them. And we have to be careful, particularly in religious communities, if we have not dealt with the deeper narcissism or egoism or false self or sinful self, that in fact we can use goods to serve questionable purposes. And that involves what the Ignatian tradition was all about, was discernment and discrimination of desires and voices that speak to us. And if we're not aware of those things, then we just become the victims of them. We just become the victims of false voices that are speaking to us, and we passively accept them. In our real life, we would never allow thieves to get in our normal homes, but we often allow the thieves of problematic thoughts to get in the home of our souls, and the security system is not strong because we have not dealt with a strong security system. And this is what the mothers and the fathers of the church, when they used the Bible, this was what they were trying to get at, is a strong security system so that we knew when thieves of problematic desires, ideas, whatever, were trying to break into the house or soul. So maybe it's, 25? I usually have 3 hours for a lecture, so this is, I'll stop now. So why don't you, this was supposed to, when was this one supposed to end? 1:30.